I've been asked to discuss sort of major common debates that we see around the world about school choice. The reality is, as you heard, I'm from the United States. I know much more about the US system than I know about systems around the world. And so a lot of what the benefit to me of this conference has been is that I've learned a lot of things about what's going on in other countries from people in those countries. And we're going to, I think, hear some more soon about that. So I'm going to give you sort of a 10,000-foot level about some major tensions that we have in school choice in lots of different places. I hope you'll tell me when you get the chance about your own country. I thought that my comparative advantage in this talk would be that, okay, I don't know the details of any given country all that well, other than my own, but I might have the best sort of view of a whole bunch of different places. But then I saw Pauline Dixon is speaking, and one of the sources for my figuring out other countries' problems and debates was I used the book she just edited. So I'm not even the best, I guess, here at knowing a broad sense of what's going on elsewhere. But I'm going to do my best, but Pauline Dixon may know even more about it than I do. Basically, I'm going to talk about three major tensions. I've got to use this. I'll go into some details on them. I'll just give you real quickly what they are. So stratification or segregation is one concern about school choice. In the United States, we often use the term balkanization, but these are all terms that are used for the idea that if we have school choice, people will separate from each other. The plus side, the reason that people want school choice that is sort of the opposite of this, is pluralism, it's diversity. It's that we want people with different beliefs and values and backgrounds and desires for their children, and whose children have different talents and want to do different things in their lives, that you need to have an education system where there's education provided that's consistent with what diverse people want and diverse people need. That means a choice system, not a system where basically a uniform school is provided for everyone and they're assigned to it based on their home address. So that's really the first big debate that we see, and I'll go into more detail on that. Then sort of related to this is this idea of religious pluralism, but religion itself has become a very big issue in some places with school choice. So again, the idea has been, and a lot of the development of school choice in many countries has been driven by a desire for people with different religious backgrounds to get education consistent with what they believe, and to end very painful conflicts that countries suffered as one religious denomination or group tried to control all the schools, or all the schools were made secular, and that wasn't satisfactory to many people. The concerns about this deal often with assimilation, especially as there's more immigration in many countries. There's a concern that, well, we'll have people of different backgrounds, and in particular maybe different religions, who will come to our country and not be consistent with our culture, with our cultural ethos, with our background. And we need to use the education system to assimilate them, to make them more like the overall society. And then we have a fear, and this is typically in most countries that I've seen related more toward Islamic education than anyone else, but a fear of radicalization, that a country will allow schools that radicalize students, that teach them that the country they're in is dangerous. In the United States, where I'm from, we actually have a variation of this that I'll talk about some more, but it's more concerned about conservative Christians, not so much about Muslims. And then finally, we've had some discussion about this already, but there's worried about academic outcomes. So on the pro side, the argument is if we have school choice, schools have to compete, educators have to compete for business. That will lead to better outcomes because presumably schools will compete based on quality. This was Milton Friedman was put up earlier today. This was largely Milton Friedman's argument. But there's a flip side to this. There's the argument or concern that parents simply don't know what they should be asking for, and that government has to be the expert and decide what are the right academic outcomes, and only government is positioned to know how to deliver them. And these are, again, very common debates that we're seeing. And again, I'm going to go into all these in a little more detail. What I have here, though, is a chart that I found, I don't agree with all these classifications, but it's a pretty good way if you want to look at one thing to see how different countries have predominantly moved to school choice or why they may be moving to more choice. This gives you an idea, a classification of places. Importantly, there's a lot that this misses, a lot that is overlap. The United States, in many ways, is similar to the Netherlands and Belgium and Spain in this classification, where they say that part of the move to school choice was to achieve church-state compromises. That was a big part of why the United States had school choice, has it now, and was moving towards school choice. But the United States doesn't get put on that. So just when you look at this, it's maybe a 60% or 70% explanation. I should also define school choice for you, or at least how I am using it. So basically, the way I use school choice is that government, because we have free market education. School choice is typically not the same as free market education, but it's moving in that direction. But school choice is typically government in some way makes it so that a plurality of schools is accessible to people. It can be really through two major mechanisms. One is direct funding to private schools to lower their costs, subsidies. In many places, this is called a government-aided private school. And then there are programs where instead of funding the schools directly, money is given to families to control, and then they can take it to a private school to pay the tuition. So the tuition isn't subsidized because the school is subsidized. It is the purchaser who receives the subsidy. But both of those are intended so that you have plural affordable options, a Catholic school, Protestant school, Muslim school, arts-based school, science-based school, all sorts of Montessori, you name it, and in theory, they could all be accessible. And the contra to this is a system in which the government establishes schools and then assigns people to a school. Typically, this is done by a government-established school. You're in a catchment area for it based on your home address, and you get sent there. So that's the norm in opposition to school choice. So I'm going to talk now about the first of these three major controversies, this idea of stratification being the concern, but pluralism, freedom for diverse people, essentially being the driver of school choice. You ultimately want to have, at least this is the school choice argument, options to choose different worldviews. I mean, this is really important. Education is not only about, are you learning math, are you learning how to read? It is also the transmission of values to the next generation. And we simply do not all agree on what the right values are. And that is, to me, the primary reason for school choice. It's not really the competition to get better test scores. That's certainly important. But the idea, and this was particularly big in the United States, that the history is about a whole lot of immigration, a whole lot of different people of different religions coming in and trying to create an education system that didn't treat some of those people unequally. And so the idea is you want to make room for all those people. But there is concern. So the Netherlands, I think, has the most school choice, depending on how you define school choice. But you can certainly access a whole lot of different options. And that was done intentionally because of religious disputes. Who would control the government schools? But the concern that I read when I read people around the world who talk about this is that they don't like this idea of pillarization, which goes beyond education, but the idea that different communities within a country will have their own set of institutions, among them the school. They're afraid that that separates people artificially. And so that's the concern, is this pillarization. There's another concern that isn't usually about values, it's not necessarily about your ethnic background, but in some countries, and probably in many, but it's not predominant in some, the concern is economic segregation, that people of means will use school choice to further remove themselves in education from lower income families. The reality is we already see a lot of that because if you were assigned to a school based on your home address, wealthier people tend to live with wealthier people and already be separated. But that is another one of the concerns. An exemplar of this concern about economic stratification, I think, is Chile. Chile put in a very powerful school choice system in I think it was the 1980s is when it began. But there were concerns about this segregation. They eventually went to something called a weighted student formula, where they assigned more money to lower-income people to try and overcome this. But this is the prime example of where this fear of segregation by economic status was biggest. But we also see it, interestingly, in India. India doesn't have, you'll talk more about this obviously, but a school choice system, certainly that I know of in any large amount, but there is private schooling. So again, a separation of the idea that government assists versus a free market. But they put in a rule that I think it's 25% of enrollment in any private school has to be left open for people who are from the lowest castes. Again, this is a concern about economic and also cultural segregation. In the U.S., we certainly have concerns about this, but I think we tend to recognize that people are very good at segregating themselves by their housing, and depending on the state you live in, some school districts are only municipalities, and municipalities can be very stratified by income. Well, what's the research suggest on the effect of choice on stratification? The OECD says the research is ambiguous. It doesn't show powerfully one way or another that it impacts stratification. My own research suggests that that is probably accurate, because it's not education that primarily drives stratification, it is housing. So we shouldn't be surprised that choice neither overcomes a whole lot of stratification, nor that it makes it a whole lot worse. So the next area we look at is religion. Again, as I said, a big part of the history of school choice in many places is to overcome or to avoid religious conflicts, overcome the problems that those conflicts created, the paralysis that the conflicts created, and enable people to choose education consistent with their beliefs. The best example of this, again, is the Netherlands, but there's an education professor, education history expert at the Boston University named Charles Glenn, and he writes this about the country of Belgium. He says that Belgium, it left the United Netherlands, and it said it has, quote, the distinction of being possibly the only country in the world whose very existence resulted in substantial part from controversy over education. That they left because they didn't want the education they thought would be imposed on them in the United Netherlands. And again, this was also, if you know U.S. history, a major part of U.S. history. Especially when there were large waves of Catholic immigrants, public schools were predominantly Protestant, and they said these are not acceptable. In order for us to be treated equally, money needs to follow us to our schools. But many other places have seen this. Many countries, though, make it difficult to establish schools that are religious, in particular for schools that are not from a recognized community. So Muslims in particular have encountered this problem because, at least from my reading, in most countries, there is not sort of a unified leader or a recognized leader of Muslim communities. And so they don't have the connection that they need with government in order to have a recognized community, in order to have their schools receive the same sort of aid as other schools receive. There's also, I think, certainly some prejudice. At least there appears to be prejudice in some countries that keep Muslim schools from opening. But of course, one of the concerns is also radicalization, not without reason. If you were in a country that suffered a terrorist attack or an assassination, you have reason to be concerned about radicalization. But this constrains pluralism. And one of the concerns is that if you don't make it easy to have Muslim schools, you radicalize some Muslims who may not be already radicalized, but who feel marginalized by the societies in which they live. Of course, the most famous for this is probably France with laïcité, but I've observed it, at least read about this concern in other countries. Sweden, we're going to hear from Eric later, and he will tell you much more detail and correct me on all the things I'm wrong about on Sweden. But from my reading between 2019 and the start of 2023, 17 Muslim schools were actually closed, I believe as a result of inspections. It was for a number of reasons, but one of the citations was for fear of radicalization going on in the schools. So there are some examples where religious schools are closed for this fear of radicalization, at least one part of it. That said, when I look at the research, there's not really much evidence of radicalization in Muslim schools. We've looked in the United States, we haven't found very much. We looked in other countries and haven't found very much. So we tend to be, of course, afraid of the worst case scenario, but we don't tend to see this. But it is still a concern that people have, and it's not an unreasonable one. And if we're for school choice, we need to deal honestly with reasonable concerns. The last thing I'll talk about in terms of major concerns is academics. So again, as I said, the argument for school choice in the academic realm is that if we have competition among schools, they will presumably compete on quality, because presumably parents want a high-quality school. And that competition will lead all schools to do better. And we would expect then that test scores would be higher. Now there's our first disconnect. It turns out that many parents do not value standardized test scores first and foremost. And so we have to be very leery of comparing schools and saying choice is working or not working just based on test scores of math outcomes or reading outcomes. Again, for many people, it's very important that their kids receive the right values. There was mention of critical thinking. There's often a concern that kids may be learning how to do well on a test, but are not learning critical thinking or creative thinking. So we have to be very careful when we say, well, does the competition of school choice work or not? And we reduce it to PISA scores or TIMSS scores or whatever our national exam scores are. Education is about a lot more than exams. And then in the United States, we, early in our experimentation with school choice, if you're talking about really around 1990 is when we passed our first modern school choice program in Milwaukee, we very quickly started applying standardized tests to see how students were doing, to try and determine if school choice worked better than being assigned to a public school. The early tests suggested there was probably some small advantage to school choice versus being assigned to your public school on standardized tests. But more recently, and as school choice has matured, it's grown a lot in the United States. It's in a lot more states. Of course, every state in the United States has different rules and policies regarding school choice. But we've started to see research that suggests there may be negative impacts on standardized test scores in private school choice programs. It depends how you write your law. So Louisiana, who you can see on here, if you look down the bottom, see if I can work the laser. I did. New Orleans is the largest city in Louisiana, but the whole state actually has adopted private school choice programs. What New Orleans had done was when Hurricane Katrina basically leveled the city and its already terrible education system, they put in a system of all charter schools. Charter schools are a little different from private schools. They are technically public schools, but a private entity is in charge of them and is freed of many rules and regulations that control traditional public schools. And you're not assigned to a charter school, you choose it. However, charter schools have to follow a state curriculum, they have to give state tests, so they are restrained more than most private schools. But Louisiana put in a school choice program for the state that had a lot of regulations requiring testing, evaluation of private schools based on their performance on state tests, and that caused some of the best performing private schools, or at least the best regarded, to stay out of the program. They said, we don't want that control. So you were left with a comparison of really the poorly performing private schools, the ones that were already struggling, and people said, well, look, their test scores aren't as good, so school choice must not work. But it's crucially important to know the details of the program. Again, I'll talk about Sweden, but again, I will note that Eric knows much more about this than I do, and he's going to tell you all about it shortly. And we've already been over this a little bit. Of course, Sweden in the early 1990s went to a very, at least considered a very pro-school choice system. But they did it alongside lots of other reforms and lots of other changes that impact testing outcomes. Nonetheless, as PISA scores dropped, and perhaps there were some other scores that people were looking at, but OECD education head Andreas Schleicher, he said that clearly what happened to Sweden was there was too much decentralization and too much school choice, and they need to stop doing that, or at least change how they do it to fix it. But the reality is, if you look at the totality of research on school choice outcomes, even about testing, I think the best you'd say is it's mixed. It is not clearly that school choice leads to bad testing outcomes or really good testing outcomes. It depends a great deal on how you structure your system and what parents value. I'd also say that there was research done, well, I should say that competition also is extremely important unto itself. So we said that, well, when we do these comparisons, school choice versus not school choice, we don't always find that there are better test scores in the private schools than in the public schools. But competition, one of the most clear things we have found in research, and otherwise it's repeated in experiment after experiment after experiment, is that competition fuels better testing outcomes in public schools. The more competition those schools face, in other words, we look at a public school and we say, well, how many private options are around it, or charter options? Do the ones with more of that competition do better than the ones with less? And repeatedly, we have found that to be the case. So competition seems clearly to work. However, they aren't huge differences. And that is something also we should come to realize, I think. Most of the research that I've seen suggests that schools have much less impact on outcomes, especially standardized tests, than things that happen outside of schools. I think we talked a little bit about families. What families do have a much bigger impact on kids' outcomes on standardized tests, usually than schools do. So we also need to be careful if we say, well, is school choice working or not? We are very careful about, well, who are those schools serving? So what have different countries looked at to try and kind of balance these concerns? Well, most of you are probably more familiar with this than I am, but in the United States, we've started to see a term used for, they call it pluralism. I've talked about pluralism to mean diversity, but there are people like Professor Glenn, Professor Berner, also at Johns Hopkins, uses the term pluralism to say, we want a system of education where you can choose schools that have different worldviews, religious, it could be how you teach, like a Montessori school or a Steiner school, but we also want to make sure that the greater community has influence over what happens in those schools, and that we don't radicalize people, and that we don't allow schools to tell parents that they're teaching one thing and they're not. And so they call this pluralism, where you would have a national curriculum that all private schools have to follow, certainly if they're private aided schools, that they would have to teach tolerance of others. So if you were in a religious school, presumably you could say, well, we disagree on religion, but the people who think differently we do are not bad. And they would sometimes, like an inspectorate, where government inspectors would go into these schools and evaluate them. Now, I think if you are like the United States, and we like to take school choice to scale, in other words, make it the norm, that might be compromised politically to move things forward, if that's all we could do. But I don't think that's the ideal. The ideal is we give people true freedom, both educators to educate as they think is right, and families to choose the education that they think is correct, and for those people to freely come together in a free market. But if you want to move the ball politically, often there is compromise, and that seems to be the compromise that works in many countries. Also, weighted student funding, which I think actually makes a little more sense. So again, Chile has moved to weighted student funding, where you provide more money for a student who may be low income or who may have disabilities than somebody who is from higher income and doesn't have disabilities. Because it's true that the cost to educate some people is greater than others, and the idea of choice is to equalize some of that. I also have a little bit of good news. because there was talk in the last panel about the possibility of Switzerland moving to school choice, and it sounded like there was some pessimism about that happening. I have been in the school choice debate in the United States for about 25 years now, and nobody that I ever talked to about, if you asked 4 years ago, would have thought we'd have states pass universal school choice programs. Those are programs where there are no limits on who can qualify. Anybody of any income can qualify. It doesn't matter whether you're assigned to a bad public school or not. Everybody can qualify. Well, in 2022, probably our freest state, Arizona passed the first truly universal school choice program. Anybody can get school choice money to basically not only go where they want to go, to private schools, but these are called education savings accounts. So you could use this money also to pay for tutoring if you wanted. You can use it to pay as a homeschooler for curricula. We didn't think we would see universal school choice, and suddenly we did. And then in the last year or so, we've had, I think it's now 10 states have passed universal or nearly universal school choice. So if you'd asked me a few years ago if that was going to happen, I said no, impossible. But it happened in the United States. I think it can probably happen anywhere, because there's a conception that the United States is all free market. People refer to us as cowboys sometimes, like it's the Wild West. But we had very little school choice. The expectation was people would go to their public schools. And it's only in the last few years that we've seen this sea change where choice has now become the norm. That's basically all I have for you on this topic. I'm looking forward to taking questions. I want to do a shout out for something which I didn't mention I was going to do, but I've been speaking with some people who may be interested in international comparisons of education and have talked about school choice around the world. And I don't run this conference, but there is the International School Choice and Reform Conference that's been run for, I think, the last 13 or 14 years. I go to a lot of them. I don't make it to all of them. But if you're really interested in this topic, and if you work in this, you will want to look up the International School Choice and Reform Conference. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk to you about it. Again, I'm not one of the organizers, but I know the organizers. And basically every other year, it fluctuates between meeting in Florida and meeting somewhere abroad. Our most recent meeting in January was in Madrid, Spain. They'd met in Dublin and in Portugal, and then otherwise in Florida. So if this is an area you are really interested in working in, that is an excellent conference to participate in. And with that, I think I'm at questions.
Please, Pedro.
I don't see in your path towards privatization anything about France. There's a great deal of problems in France. They try to impose neutral lay schools by forbidding even the wearing of any religious symbols, and the tensions in France and around Paris and other places are very strong, the tensions. They don't know what to do. They have a very large Muslim population, and they don't know how to deal with that, not only through housing, but also through schooling. Do you know about France?
Yes, so I didn't include France for the most part because they're not an exemplar of school choice. They don't have a lot of school choice, though you can choose a Catholic school if you don't want a traditional public school. Of course, that's in part because Catholicism, while not part of the government clearly anymore, is sort of part of the culture. But I think the situation in France may be an illustration of how, if you want to avoid radicalization, the way you do it is embracing the ability to choose something that is different from the norm. So if you marginalize a community, you shouldn't be surprised when they start to feel unhappy and angry. I had read not too long ago about many Muslims in France will go to Catholic schools not because they're certainly Catholic, but they feel there's less hostility in those schools to religion in general. And so I think France may be a good illustration of you want to more embrace the ability of people to choose things that maybe you wouldn't choose yourself, that maybe you even have concerns about, because you don't want to marginalize different groups. I also, and again, I would love to hear from people in these countries, but as I was reading in preparation for this, I don't remember what the other countries were, but 2 or 3 others in this book I was reading suggested that it's not just France, for instance, that has prohibitions on face coverings, certainly in schools, but maybe elsewhere, but some other countries. And so France is usually the example that is most concerning to people in my experience, but I don't think they're alone.
My question is the following. I understand that you led the presentation on demand for school choice. But I had my personal experience of my daughter that went to an entity called International School that has many schools all over the world. They have a central in Geneva. They just hired the past education minister of Finland, which has a very high educational reputation. And they are trying to, so to say, become a world supplier of choice, of school choice. So what is your understanding? May we also be facing a phenomenon of not only grassroots, but even from top offering a better educational system worldwide?
Yes, well, so I don't have a good sense of how much supply is changing around the world as school choice grows. I think in the next couple of presentations you'll hear more about this. I can speak best about the United States. And we certainly have seen the supply of schools growing, but I wouldn't say they are typically of large organizations of schools. We have some of those. So we are seeing a phenomenon of something we call micro schools, which are very small schools that will pop up and serve maybe 20 or 25 people or students. They're sort of like one-room schoolhouses. They're started by kind of entrepreneurial people who think that the students can receive a lot of their instruction on computers, and then the teachers are there to assist them when they run into trouble. And then often the latter half of the day will be project-based learning. One of the most famous is, at least to people who do school choice in the United States, is something called Acton Academies. And they were started by a man named Jeff Sandifer, who is, he's involved in energy in Texas, I think is how he made most of his money, but he's very interested in entrepreneurship and in education. And I think the last I checked, there are probably over 100 Acton Academies, all probably started in the last 10 years. I don't know how viable they are. Certainly some have gone out of business, others are still going. But we are starting to see that, and then we have a lot of kind of small, what you'd call individual, sometimes we say the word mom and pop, micro schools that are just independent. And we'll see how that all plays out. They're all very new. A lot of them started under COVID-19 when people couldn't access a large school, usually their public school, and parents would get together and say, we're going to create our own school where it would be small, where we'd know each other, where we could control exposure to COVID if we need to. And it turns out a lot of people like that model. But we also have some experience. There was a man named Chris Whittle who started something called Edison Academy. I think it was Edison Schools in around the early 2000s. His idea was he would replicate the same model over and over and over and have sort of centralized administrative works, but he had to have such a big scale to be profitable, he just couldn't make it. What he discovered is, at least in the early 2000s, regulations would crush the effort to have all these schools. They were supposed to be low cost. Chris Whittle's now trying to do very expensive international schools, which may be viable if you can pay a huge tuition, but they don't see them going to scale for most people. So we're kind of early in this, but I think supply will rise to meet demand. We don't have enough experience yet to see.
But still, you're telling us that the US is sort of an educational laboratory with 10 states already having universal private schooling. And how do you explain then the fact that at least in the 22 scores, the US was on average relatively substandard? I mean,
So
sub-average.
For PISA,
For
score,
PISA,
there are a few explanations. One, most Americans don't care. Most Americans, when you ask them, don't put much emphasis on standardized tests. So we have PISA, which of course, most people don't take PISA, so most Americans don't even know it exists. But even their own state tests, they generally don't get upset if the state tests aren't that good. They look much more at, is my child happy in this school? Is my child thriving in the school they're in? Do I like the teachers in the school? They do want their kids to be able to read and calculate, but if they can do those things, they don't worry that much about it.
But if it's not so much about performance, as an economist I would have hoped for, but rather about having your own worldview, how about sort of a social cohesion or so? Isn't that, or is that explaining the polarization we're seeing in the US?
No, I actually think that, and I've written a book about this, so it's one thing I actually know.
So then the question was good.
Yeah, thank you for that. So the intuitive thought is, well, if we require diverse people to all go to the same schools that teach common values, common ideas, that they will all learn to get along. But that sort of presupposes that they already agree on these ideas. So my reading of history, certainly in the United States, but also other countries, is that when you try and impose this uniformity, it actually causes more division in society because you have to battle over who gets to decide what that uniformity will be.
Interesting.
There's a great Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court justice, had a great quote about that, and I wish I could do it justice. But it's basically, when you decide that there's going to be one answer for everybody, who gets to decide what that answer is?
Could you maybe tell us a little bit about developments and trends in homeschooling and the micro schools that you mentioned? Are these a sort of offshoot of those?
That's good questions. And so homeschooling, I'll define homeschooling two ways. Homeschooling typically means a family is in charge of the education of their children, not connected to an outside school. There is sometimes confusion about that, and school choice leads to more confusion. What we've seen was before COVID-19, again, at least in the United States, and in some places it's not even legal to homeschool. It's been legal in the United States in most states for 20 or 30 years now. But about 3% of students were school-aged children were homeschooled before COVID. We saw it, I think, double or more during COVID. There was, though, some confusion because so many kids were receiving education, but from their school in the home, because now it was on a computer. I think that many people didn't understand the question they were asked because it was usually ambiguous. And we have seen then homeschooling numbers decline since COVID has ended, but is still significantly above what it was. So you've seen homeschooling was already being embraced by a lot of people before COVID, even more now. You are correct in surmising that microschooling seems to be, to a large extent, an extension of homeschooling, where people are saying, look, I may not be able to supply all the education my kids need myself, but I can be part of a small school where someone else does a lot of that, but I still have a lot of control over it. And we have also, even before COVID, had something called homeschooling co-ops, where homeschoolers would teach at home 2 or 3 days a week, but to get specialized instruction, like science instruction, they would all come together in a place where they would get a biologist or a physicist or somebody would teach that science. So there were already gray areas in homeschooling, but generally speaking, homeschooling has grown and has, I think, extended into other ways of delivering education.
Thanks a lot for these interesting insights.